subject of origins is a controversial issue. There are basically two views when it comes to looking at the idea of when things began, how they began, and what took place during this process. Evolution is man's speculation on the subject of the origin and the history of life. As no human being was there, the evolutionary idea is based on man's ideas of what could have happened, but not based on any observations. On the other hand, the creation worldview is based on a biblical revelation. That is, if you are a biblical creationist. And the Bible gives us some insights into what took place, and then we can go out into the world and we can see whether or not the biblical model can be supported by the evidence. Now, as I begin tonight, I want to share just a short word of testimony with you. For many years of my life, I did not believe in the creationist view. I believed in the evolutionary worldview. In fact, I taught biology from that perspective. About 14 years ago, some changes took place in my life. I became a creationist, and then several months later, a biblical creationist, and then a Christian. And today I stand here as a representative of God's grace in my life, as I now have come to realize that this book really is true and that it can be supported by the observable evidence. And tonight as I begin, I want to turn to the book of Psalms and just read a few verses which basically summarize exactly what I believe at this time. We could turn to Psalm 119. And looking first of all at verse 105. The Bible says, "Thy word is a lamp to my feet. It is a light to my path." In verse 130, "The unfolding of thy words gives light. It gives understanding to the simple." And verse 169, "Let my cry come before thee, O God. Give me understanding according to thy word." So a biblical creationist looks at the Bible model on this subject of origins, and then looks at the world to see whether or not there's evidence out there to support it. And that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to look at the foundational principles of creation and see whether or not they can be backed up and supported by the observable evidence. According to the Bible, the beginning began this way. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1. "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." So according to this account, there was a supernatural beginning of all things. An all-powerful creator God, a designer, planner, brought things into existence. And of course, the scriptures say he brought into existence the heavens and the earth. And as we look at this, we can simply state God created everything which exists in the universe. He created all of the stars that we see, the Milky Way. He created our solar system. And of course, he created the planet Earth. But there's also another way of studying the various words that are used here in Hebrew, which give us some further insight into what God is telling us what he did. You see, any constructor, any designer, any builder would begin with building blocks. And that's what God did. He began with building blocks, and he's telling us how he did that. Everything which exists in the entire universe is made up of atoms. Those are the basic components of everything that we see. And notice atoms are made up of three components: space, and matter, and energy. And when we study Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 3, we see that that's what God is telling us. He brought into existence, first of all, space, which is the Hebrew word shamayim, which is the word heavens. He brought into existence the substance from which things are made, or matter, which is the word earth, or the Hebrew word eret. And the Bible tells us that this earth, or matter, is without form or void. It hadn't been brought into any meaningful form. And so we could compare this to a stack of Lego blocks that have been tossed haphazardly on the floor, without order, without form. And on the right-hand side, we see where they have brought into some meaningful existence, into some design. And that's what God did. He took the matter and he formed meaningful matter or atomic structure by bringing in the third component, energy or light, as the Bible describes it. And light is not just the visible portion of the electromagnetic spectrum that we see. Light contains all of the various wavelengths of energy that we know about in the universe, the electromagnetic spectrum. And so we have energy, we have matter, and we have space, or the three building blocks of atoms which make up everything which exists in the universe. Another important principle of the creation model is that the Bible tells us that God did something very unique with water. His Spirit moved upon the face of the waters. And we know that water is absolutely essential for life. You cannot have life without water. We can see that water has many unique characteristics, unique to other components or other elements. So God did something unique with water, and we see that it lines up again with the observable evidence, water being necessary for living things. Now we move on into another important phase of the creation model. According to the biblical view, the original earth was very different than the earth that we know it today. We can turn to Genesis chapter 1 and read from verses 6 to 7, which gives us an account and tells us what the original earth was like. It appears that the original earth was surrounded by some kind of a water form around it. Genesis chapter 1, verses 6 and 7. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse, and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so." Now, many people have read these verses and wondered, what is it that the Bible is describing? It's very simple. According to the biblical account, the original earth was surrounded by some form of water. Now, this diagram, which we're showing you here, certainly is not attempting to be drawn to scale, but what we're illustrating is that the earth in the original form was encapsulated or surrounded by water in some form. And we're told that the waters above separated from the waters below by a firmament or an area where the birds fly, we're told in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 20. So this water layer, and we can call it a water canopy layer, was above the earth, separated by the firmament, and created a totally different condition than anything that we know of today. Perhaps it was somewhat similar to the ozone layer that we have today, which is a surrounding layer around the earth which protects our environment from shortwave radiation. But this condition, this water vapor condition or water condition, would have created a greenhouse effect which would have created a totally different environment than anything that we know of today on our planet. You see, in a greenhouse today, light travels through the panes of the greenhouse and creates a condition where plants or animals could live in a very vigorous condition and grow vigorously. The original earth, protected by water, would have allowed the radiation from the sun, the long-wave radiation from the sun, to go through and also create a greenhouse or a terrarium condition. The original earth would have not had the extreme climatic conditions like we have today. It would have been subtropical, literally from pole to pole. Today there is an unequal heating of the Earth's surface, and the polar regions heat up or do not heat up as much as the equatorial regions, and as a result you have high and low pressure masses being created, and they tend to equalize each other, causing wind and rain. In the original Earth, because this condition existed with the water vapor layer surrounding it, there would not have been low pressure and high pressure masses, and there wouldn't have been any rain. And it's interesting that the scriptural account tells us at this period of time there was no rain. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 6. But a mist used to rise up from the earth and water the whole surface of the ground. So a mist came up from the earth, and that would again line up with this model, a greenhouse condition or a terrarium condition that existed in the original earth. Another important factor is that the water vapor layer would have protected the earth by filtering harmful short-wave radiation, somewhat like what the ozone layer does today. helps to filter ultraviolet radiation, which causes the breakdown of cells, the degeneration of life, causes mutations, causes cancer. In the original Earth, this water layer protected the Earth from harmful shortwave radiation, and so life living under these vigorous conditions would have been able to live longer, and if it lived longer under these conditions, very likely it would have been able to grow larger. Now, if this model, the biblical model of origins, based on a canopied Earth, has any validity, there must be some supportable evidence that we can point to from the fossil record. And indeed, there is supportable evidence. As we look at the fossil record, we find that all over the world, we find subtropical forms of life existed in the past. For example, we could go to northern parts of Canada where these palm tree leaves were found, and they've been fossilized, encased in basalt, that's volcanic rock. Now, palm trees do not grow in northern Canada in a natural condition today. In the past, they did, and there's evidence to support that. We could go to even more extreme northern regions of the planet, for example, to the new Siberian islands, which are within the Arctic Circle and only a few hundred miles from the North Pole. Here, some of the first discoverers were amazed to find fruit trees 60 feet tall with fruit and green leaves frozen in the ice. Or we could go to the Spitsbergen Islands, where palm trees have been found there as well, and the fossilized remains of marine organisms of subtropical varieties, including coral, which only lives in regions of water somewhat around subtropical regions today. Or we could look at another region in the extreme northern part of the world, in northern Alaska, where frozen in ice have been found the remains of giant saber-toothed tigers, giant sloths, animals which don't even exist today, existed in the past of subtropical varieties, and they were caught and frozen in these parts of the world suddenly and catastrophically. We could go to the Axel Heiberg Islands, again only a few hundred miles from the North Pole, where just a few years ago scientists found the remains of redwood trees. Some of the stumps were 6 feet in diameter. They found the same kinds of observations. Well, there's also evidence that life grew larger in the past. For example, moss-like plants grew to over 3 feet in height. Or we could look at the great ferns of the past, grew 50 to 70 feet tall. Horsetail reeds of the past today only grow a matter of 18 inches to 2 feet tall. In the past have been found in the fossil record 50 to 70 feet tall. Insects were much larger. Dragonflies have been found in the fossil record with wingspans over 3 feet. And cockroaches 1 foot in diameter. Not only were the insects large, but the great mollusks of the past were huge. Nautiloids 9 to 12 feet in diameter. Today their counterparts only a few inches. The great sloths of the past were 18 to 20 feet tall. Today their counterparts about the size of a small monkey. Or the rhinos of the past were 17 feet tall, 32 feet in length. And you can see here in comparison to the size of a man, they were giant creatures. Or we could look at the huge reptilian creatures of the past, the dinosaurs. They too were huge creatures. And as we'll mention a little later, it appears that they lived under these subtropical conditions literally from pole to pole. Dinosaurs, being reptilian creatures, each year that they lived grew larger and larger. And large dinosaurs were very likely just old dinosaurs that had grown many, many years to very large sizes. Another interesting factor of the creation account is given to us when we read about the genealogies of mankind. Man, living under this protected environment, before the time of the flood, lived to approximately 900 years old. And again, this is another confirmation to this particular model. Man, living under a protective, canopied earth that was sheltered from harmful radiation, could live for long periods of time. Now, some people say, well, maybe a year then wasn't the same as a year today. Well, we have no reason to say that it was different today then in the past than it is today. Some say, well, maybe the days were different. Maybe a day is 1,000,000 years. Well, the Bible tells us that each day was bounded by a morning and the evening. So the creationist account, based on a biblical view, is a creation that took place literally in literal days, not millions and millions of years ago like we have been told from the evolutionary worldview, but much more recently. And as we'll see later in our presentations, there's reason to believe that the earth is much younger than what we have been told from the evolutionary concepts. We can continue and look at some of the basic foundational principles of creation. According to the Genesis account, in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 9, and God said, "Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. So the water was together in one place. And if the water was together in one place, then we would expect the landmass was one as well. And when we look at geological maps, we are told that the original Earth was one large landmass. And scientists have given it the name Pangaea. And it's interesting that most geologists who are evolutionists believe that the Earth was one large landmass in its original form, but then broke apart and separated into the continental masses that we know today. They know that the layers of the Earth were laid down before the continents separated, because the layers in South America, for example, and in Africa are the same layers. They're identical. They were laid down horizontally, and then at a later period of time, the Earth separated. And according to the biblical creationist account, the separation took place in the days of Peleg, who lived after the Tower of Babel. In Genesis chapter 10 and verse 25, we're told, "In his days, God divided the earth," a sudden division of the land masses. Creationists believe that this division took place towards the end of the flood, which we'll be describing later. But what we do know is that the continents separated after the layers were laid down. So sometime after the flood, this occurred. So we have the one large landmass breaking apart and separating into other landmasses. Then we move on to another very important principle of the creation model. That is the creation of life. According to the biblical account, God brought life into existence suddenly, and it was perfected. And God created this life on the 3rd and the 5th and the 6th days of creation. It was not a process that took place over long periods of time. It occurred specifically in certain days, and God, using the building blocks which he had created, formed life. Life came on the scene suddenly, fully completed. Reproduction, there has to be a male and a female. There has to be the reproductive organs to reproduce one half of a male and one half of a female, the sperm and the egg. God created all forms of life, and if we look at living things, we see that they are made up of organ systems which are necessary for the organism to survive. Specific organs have specific functions which the Creator designed. They did not happen by process of chance. Or if we look at various animals, we see that God coded them with instincts, that is, understanding information that didn't have to be learned. God literally programmed information into their brains so that perpetuation of life could occur from generation to generation. But the focal point of the creation account was the creation of mankind. God brought into existence the first man, Adam, and then the first woman, Eve. And again, the Bible tells us that they were perfect. God created the first man and the first woman so that he might have human beings that he might have a relationship with, a loving relationship. But he did not create them as robots. He created them with a free will so that they could choose whether or not they wanted to have this loving relationship with their Creator. And the biblical account tells us that man made a choice not to have the relationship with the Creator because Satan came to the Garden of Eden in the embodiment of a serpent, enticed Eve to disobey God, to take of the particular tree, the forbidden tree that God had placed in the garden, and in so doing, shattered the relationship that man had with God, and the perfect creation then became imperfect. The fall of mankind triggered the fall of the creation, degeneration, mutations, and things then went downward, not upward. God was sorry, we were told in the scriptural biblical account, that he had made man after a period of time because the thoughts of man's heart was evil continually in the involvements of the things which they were doing. And so God warned this original generation of people that had developed generation after generation since the creation to turn to him. And mankind refused, and God brought a great global catastrophic judgment to the original creation. Now, in order to understand the whole creation model, it's important that we understand what took place during this great catastrophe. According to the biblical account in Genesis chapter 7 and chapter 8, the Bible says that God used his natural laws to bring a judgment to the earth. We're told, first of all, that the fountains of the great deep broke up. And with reference to this judgment, it's referring to the earth's crust fracturing. And when the earth's crust fractures, we have volcanic eruptions that occur. Molten magma coming out onto the surface of the earth, volcanic ash exuded into the environment, carbon dioxide, water coming up from within the earth onto the surface of the earth. And this event was taking place not in one or two little localized areas, but literally all over the planet, happening underneath the ocean beds and happening on the land masses as well. A worldwide volcanic catastrophe. And so life forms were caught and buried in volcanic debris and fossilized through this great catastrophe. Secondly, the biblical account says that the windows of heaven were opened. There was a cosmic destruction which occurred. The Bible doesn't tell us how God did it, but obviously something fell upon the earth from above the earth, perhaps asteroids, perhaps comets, perhaps both, but as a result, a worldwide catastrophe occurred as the windows of heaven were opened. A cosmic destruction. And the water layer surrounding the earth, the biblical account says, came down in the form of torrential precipitation. And as a result, the rain which came down, being one of the sources of the floodwaters, caused a worldwide flood. The ocean beds rose and land masses sank, and so the waters from the oceans were the second source of the floodwaters. And thirdly, the water coming out from within the earth through volcanic activity. And so eventually the entire surface of the earth was covered. It's possible that at this time there was ice deposition that occurred as well, as we find all over the world animals that have been buried suddenly, frozen catastrophically in ice with summer vegetation in their mouths. And regions that were once subtropical were totally devastated and changed and perhaps became ice polar caps in short periods of time. The Bible doesn't tell us this happened, but there's evidence throughout history that there have been icy catastrophic depositions that have occurred as a result of cosmic destructions. Eventually, the entire planet was covered in water. There were geological upheavals that were occurring as the land masses would rise. And as a result of the land masses rising, literally hundreds of cubic miles of water were quickly displaced, causing tremendous erosional forces, creating canyons in short periods of time. Tidal wave activity. waves sweeping back and forth across the landmass, mixing life forms together. And as a result, scrambling life and burying this life in flood-deposited deposition. Many forms of life caught alive in swimming positions, buried suddenly. Other forms ripped and torn apart, disarticulated, and laid down in stratas which have been formed by water activity. So the original earth was completely devastated. Now some people say, well, where do we find the humans? What happened to them? I believe that at this time, human civilization were living in cities. That's what the biblical account tells us. In Genesis chapter 4, it says, and Cain built a city. So people were living in cities. And at this time, when the great flood came, God literally destroyed these cities. And I believe that we're given some insight into what he did in the book of Ezekiel, chapter 26. The prophet Ezekiel is telling the people what is going to happen to the city of Tyre. And he's warning them that it's going to be something like what has happened in the past. In verse 19 of chapter 26, the prophet said, for thus says the Lord God, when I shall make you a desolate city, like the cities which are not inhabited, when I shall bring up the deep over you, and the great waters will cover you. Then I shall bring you down with those who go down to the pit, to the people of old, and I shall make you dwell in the lower parts of the earth, like the ancient waste places, with those who go down to the pit, so that you will not be inhabited. You see, in the past, God took cities, civilizations, and literally took them into the earth. And we've heard all kinds of legends and accounts of the lost continent of Atlantis or the lost continent of Mu. Yes, they are legends. But these legends are based upon accounts of ancient civilizations that believe that their ancestors were destroyed when the earth opened and they went down into the earth at a time of a great global catastrophe. And that is exactly what took place at this time. Only those that were in the ark, the human beings and the various forms of life that God preserved, survived this great catastrophe, as well as those animals or those organisms that could survive in water. A worldwide catastrophe. The layers were formed as a result of a worldwide event. Now, a geologist who accepts the uniformitarian position, when he looks at these layers of the earth, says that couldn't have happened by a catastrophe. It can only be explained by gradual processes which have occurred over long periods of time. And so, over the past 200 years, the idea that the Earth's layers were formed by catastrophe has been changed by a view which we call uniformitarianism. And incidentally, Peter says in the book of 2 Peter chapter 3 that in the last days, this philosophy of gradualism or uniformitarianism would be the belief of the day. And that's what evolution is based upon, is the idea of uniformitarianism. The belief is that the layers of the earth were not formed by catastrophe, but were formed over very long periods of time. That the earth has a history of billions of years of age, and that the layers that we see were formed very gradually over many years of time. Along with this idea is that life developed and progressed over long periods of time. Non-life became life and then developed from simple to complex. And so the idea is that we should be able to find the record of life developing through these layers of the earth over these long periods of time. And so in the 1800s, in the mid-1800s, a theory was put forward trying to explain why we have layers and the origin and history of life. And the chart that we're looking at here is called the geological chart. On the left-hand side are the various layers of the earth which have been drawn on the chart. At the bottom of the chart are layers which are supposed to be the oldest. And then as we go upward, the chart, we are told that these layers are much younger until eventually we get to the top. These are the most recent layers. On the right-hand side of the chart, we're shown various forms of life, beginning with simple single-celled organisms at the bottom, and then progressing to become multicellular organisms. Clams appear, and then eventually they become fish, and then amphibians, and then reptiles, and then on up the scale to birds, mammals, and man. And so this chart is supposed to be an accurate representation explaining the age of the earth and the history of life during these long periods of time. Totally opposite the creationist biblical worldview. Now, this chart, which was constructed in the 1800s, is still used today to date layers of the earth and to date the fossils. And it's used as a scale of measuring time and when certain kinds of life forms lived. And it's based on some very serious assumptions which cannot be backed up and supported by the observable evidence. And it's really based on what we would call circular reasoning. The amazing thing is that this chart, as we see it here, cannot be found anywhere in the entire world, in the real world, in the geological layers, in the order and the sequence of life which we are shown. And yet it is claimed to be accurate. Now let me explain to you how the chart is used to date fossils and to date the ages of layers. It's done in what I would call a circular reasoning pattern. And to illustrate this, I want to explain to you how a certain farmer weighed his pig. He didn't have access to a modern scale. So he decided he would make his own scale, and he found a plank on the farm and a sawhorse. He placed the pig on one end of the plank, and then he searched around all over the farm until he found a rock that exactly balanced the pig. He was so excited that he had found this rock, because it took him a long time, that he decided that he would estimate the weight of the rock. And so he came up with an estimation. He was so confident that his estimation was accurate, he then went to market and he believed that he had determined the exact weight of the pig. Now that's circular reasoning. Why? Because he weighed the pig based upon a rock that balanced the pig that he had guessed at. Not scientific, simply estimation. Now, you might wonder, what does that have to do with dating fossils or layers? Well, geologists date fossils and layers in the same way that the farmer weighed his pig. Let me give you an illustration. Let's say that you found a trilobite fossil, and you wanted to know how old it was. You went to a university with your trilobite in your hand, and you took it to a geologist and said, "Could you tell me, how old is this fossil?" Well, he would be able to tell you immediately. He would take you to the geological chart, and he would show you the trilobite on the chart. And he would say, "Oh, your trilobite is about 400 to 500 million years old." How did he know that? Well, you see, these dates were simply assumed, might I say, guessed at, over 150 years ago. Now, you might want to know how old a layer is. And you find a particular layer, and you look at the layer, and if a geologist was with you, he would say, "I can tell you how old the layer is, let's find a fossil." And you would look carefully through the layer until you found a fossil. And then you would take the fossil to the geological chart and look and find the fossil, and then you would immediately know how old the layer is. Now, do you see the problems here? This chart was simply arbitrarily estimated or guessed at. No one was there in the past to watch these layers being formed. No one knows how long it takes to lay down one of these layers. And I can tell you that the sequence of life that we see here doesn't exist anywhere in the entire world. There are some major problems with the evolutionary worldview on the history of life based on the geological column. Now, what we want to do in this latter part of our presentation is to show you how layers and fossils are found. We're going to look at the observable evidence. First of all, we might ask the question, well, how do we know how long it takes to lay down a particular layer? If this is going to be scientific, we should be able to be on location and make observations. Well, obviously, we can't do that about things that have happened in the past. But we do know today that layers can be formed rather quickly. It doesn't necessarily take millions of years of time. And I refer to a recent catastrophe that occurred in northwestern United States when Mount St. Helens erupted. A great catastrophe took place on a localized scale. And you remember what we saw. Trees were ripped off the mountain and they were swept down the slopes and buried in volcanic debris. But what most people have not been told is that during this catastrophe, after geologists went in and observed the destruction, found that layers were formed in just a matter of a few minutes during this great catastrophe. And standing here on top of this particular cliff, Dr. John Morris of the Institute of Creation Research. Do you realize that this location has to cause us to question our conventional views on how layers can be formed? So it doesn't take millions and millions of years of time to form layers. And in the same location, great canyons were carved out, again in the matter of minutes or hours. It does not take millions of years to form canyons by erosional processes during a catastrophe. Now, speaking of canyons, we have one of the greatest canyons on the Earth's surface here in the United States, the Grand Canyon. And it is also composed of layers. And when we look at the layers that make up the Grand Canyon, geologists will admit the layers were laid down by water activity. Well, they say it took place millions and millions of years of time as oceans came in and then gradually left. And there was just gradual sedimentation that took place over millions of years. How do we know? Who was there and made these observations? We look at the canyon, and today we're told that it was formed as a result of the Colorado River just trickling through there over these millions and millions of years of time. How do we know that that happened? The walls of the canyon are very vertical. Perhaps there was a sudden erosional force that occurred, and today some geologists think that inland United States was drained suddenly to the Pacific Ocean when fissures of the earth opened up and water drained through these cracks and created a great canyon in short periods of time. I believe that that could have taken place. We could look at some other features of the earth which indicate to us that the geological column has some problems. For example, we could go to this mountain here in Canada called Mount Yamnuska. It is a mountain that is literally upside down. By that I mean that the top layer here belongs to one of the oldest layers in the geological column, the Cambrian. And it's on the top of the mountain. And underneath this top layer, starting here where the sloping occurs, is a layer called the Cretaceous, based upon the fossils that are found in it. This layer is supposed to be 500 million years old. This layer is only 200 million years old. Now, how do you get the old layer on top of the young layer? Well, that's very easy. We're told that the old layer shifted up vertically over millions of years of time, and then gradually went horizontally over top of the younger layer. But when you climb up and you examine the transition between the old layer, the Cambrian, and the younger layer, the Cretaceous, there's a coal seam that separates the two. And there's no evidence that this mountain shifted, the old over the younger. In fact, there are literally hundreds of thousands of square miles like this all over northern Canada and the northern United States. The column is not found the way we are told that it's found. Or we might ask the question, well, how do we have fossils formed? Is there any mechanism today that we can study that shows us how this occurred? And believe me, all over the world, there are billions and billions of fossils which indicate that in the past, life was buried suddenly. That's how you have fossils. Today, if a fish dies, it rots. If a frog dies, it rots. If a mammal dies, it rots. You see, in the past, there were some different conditions because we have all kinds of fossils of fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, and they're buried suddenly and catastrophically. All over the world, we have clams with their valves shut. They have been buried alive. All over the world, we have fish buried in swimming positions, every detail perfectly preserved. We have amphibians, we have reptiles, showing us that they have been suddenly and catastrophically buried alive. Not just in local catastrophes, because these are all over the planet. Something has happened in the past which has destroyed life. There are polystrate fossils around the world which indicate that trees, for example, have been buried suddenly. This particular one here, partway through a coal seam which is supposed to have taken hundreds of millions of years to form. And then a sandstone layer which is supposed to have taken hundreds of millions of years to form. How do you get a tree to stand there that long and fossilize? Some catastrophe has obviously occurred which has buried and destroyed life. We find all over the world the remains of dinosaurs buried, some in swimming positions, some with their bones ripped and torn apart, disarticulated, fragments of dinosaur bones buried in layers that have been laid down by water activity. It's interesting when we look at dinosaurs, and especially artist representations of the conditions that they lived in, we see that they were surrounded usually by subtropical vegetation, and usually artists represent volcanoes in the background. Why is that? Because dinosaurs are found literally from pole to pole, buried with subtropical vegetation and volcanic materials. Now that's interesting, especially in light of the biblical creationist model. Because according to this view, dinosaurs lived under this canopied earth in subtropical conditions and were wiped out by a catastrophe which involved volcanic activity and a cosmic destruction. And some of the newest theories on dinosaur extinction say dinosaurs were wiped out by a worldwide event involving volcanism and a cosmic destruction. But most geologists would totally reject the view that this could have been a global flood. Here in Alberta, Canada, in Dinosaur Provincial Park, in this particular region, I was there several years ago doing some film documentary work on dinosaurs. In this region, over 300 dinosaurs have been found, many of them bones pulled apart, but they believe that they drowned in this one location. I asked the geologist, how is it possible that so many dinosaurs could have drowned in this one location? He said, well, there was a local flood here. And what happened during the flood season, the river was running very high, and one dinosaur was attempting to cross the river, and he tripped and drowned. The second one that was following him tripped over him, and he drowned. The third over the first two, eventually 300 tripped over each other and drowned in the same location in a local flood. But you can go to Montana, and they'll tell you the same thing. There was a local flood in Montana, or the same in Utah, or the same in Brazil, or the same in Mongolia. Anywhere around the world, geologists will admit there were local floods that killed the dinosaurs. But if someone suggests that perhaps maybe this was a global event, then one is considered to be a religious fanatic who is trying to support a biblical view. But you see, no one was there in the past. How do we know that there could not have been a worldwide catastrophic event? The evidence points that way very clearly. Worldwide, we do not only find dinosaurs buried in these flood-deposited conditions, and as I mentioned, in some cases, the dinosaurs are literally in swimming positions. In Mongolia, they've been found standing in quicksand, buried suddenly. Most cases, their bones have been torn apart and they're mixed together with wood and even other fossils of other animals. And today we see the remains of dinosaurs in museums, fully articulated, all of the bones put together, but that's very seldom they even find a good portion of a dinosaur in one place. They're torn apart. Worldwide, we find life forms buried in volcanic materials, and we find all kinds of volcanic material around the world. For example, in a region surrounding the Hudson's Bay of Canada, here, very large bay, which some people today believe was created when a large asteroid or meteorite slammed in the earth. We see surrounding it in this red area here is just a map showing an outflow of magma that has occurred in the past as molten materials have come out of the earth, inside of the earth, onto the earth. And we find huge masses of lava flows literally all over the world. And various kinds of fossils are buried in them and fossilized. Here in the Yellowstone Park in northern United States, we find large trees, redwood trees, on the high peaks of the mountains, which have been buried in volcanic breccia. And the trees have been turned from organic, that is living, to stone. They've been fossilized because they've been buried in this volcanic material. Or we can go to the petrified forest in Arizona. Some people would like to rename this the petrified log jam because that's what it looks like. These trees have been flooded in, and they're huge, giant trees. Some of them are 200 to 300 feet in length, and you'll notice that they are buried in volcanic materials, which has been laid down by water activity, flood deposition. And this area looks something very similar to what we would have observed after Mount St. Helens had erupted. So life forms have been buried worldwide. We could go to the foothills of the Himalaya mountains, where those that have been there see so many different animals and so many different varieties. They say it looks like life was wiped out and destroyed all at one time. Well, if it looks that way, maybe it was. And that's what the Bible says happened. But evolutionists refuse to admit that such a catastrophe could have occurred. We could go to the Love Bone Beds in Archer, Florida. A number of years ago, in an excavation about the size of a gymnasium, over 1 million fossils were found. Many different varieties, and this particular article tells us that to find so many fossils all in one place is literally incredible. It's unbelievable. It says that life must have been very rich and productive in this location. Now, what they found there were marine organisms and freshwater organisms, plants and animals, all scrambled together. In order to describe it, they say a freshwater stream flowed lazily from the north into a saltwater marsh. You see, for years, evolutionists did not want to admit catastrophes, so they had to explain these fossil beds as having formed very gradually over long periods of time. The article goes on to tell us some of the creatures that they have found there. Land animals that have been found include snakes, rodents of various kinds, 2 species of raccoon, 4 species of wolves, a saber-toothed cat, an elephant, a tapir, 2 species of rhinos, 7 kinds of horses, a llama, 3 species of camels. And then it states, the climate looks to have been even more tropical and lush than Florida today. You see, mixed together with alligators and turtles and fish were all of these other forms of life, mammals, buried in a condition, they say, that looked to have been more tropical than Florida today. You see, that agrees with this biblical creationist perspective as well. We could go to the Axel Heiberg Islands once more and show you that these layers that they find just a few hundred miles from the North Pole, layers that contain redwood trees, that contain vegetation that looks like it could have come out of the Florida Everglades, were laid down by some kind of a watery deposition. It tells us the island's forests, or the ancient forests, owe their remarkable preservation to the broad floodplain in which they grew. You mean these trees and these life forms were buried by a flood? That's what it tells us. And they tell us that in this time that this happened, rivers meandered through swampy forests carrying the sediments and eroded from a mountain range in the west. Every so often, floodwaters rose above the banks and deposited thick layers of sand and silt. Instead of being washed away, the leaf litter was sealed with a cover of the sediments that prevented the trees, and they were covered over in flood deposition. Flood deposition. All over the world, flood deposition. Animals buried, plants buried, catastrophically, not gradually. You do not get fossils formed by gradual processes. And finally, we could go to the trilobite beds. In Field, British Columbia, on the high peaks of the mountains near Field, British Columbia, in the layers called Cambrian because of the fossils that they contain, trilobites are found. Not only trilobites, but many, many complex, multicellular forms of life found mixed together with the trilobites. A very famous location where many people have made observations. But in this particular article, we are told that there's something amazing that has been discovered. In a Vancouver Sun newspaper, this statement was made. Because so many forms of life appear in one of the oldest layers, they are starting to reevaluate some of their ideas regarding evolution. And the statement is made. The textbook, Evolutionary Tree, with everything traced back to a few common ancestors, is inaccurate. Instead, evolution is a thicket with a rich diversity of species in the remote past. Now let me repeat what they said. The evolutionary tree, with everything traced back to a common ancestor, is inaccurate. Now I'm not quoting to you out of the Bible and Science newsletter or the Institute of Creation Research Acts and Facts. This is a secular newspaper. And they're telling us that this tree, the Darwinian tree of life, is inaccurate. It doesn't exist. Now we should make some observations. If this doesn't exist, then why is it that today in California we are being told that evolution is the basis of all science, and that in order to present science in the classroom, only evolution can be presented. It's the only factual, observable worldview that's credible. There's some problems. You see, we don't think for ourselves anymore in our generation. It's amazing what's taking place in the Soviet Union. While I was there, I was invited to speak to professors, educators, regarding biblical creation. Because they have come to realize a long time ago that Darwinian evolution was bankrupt. But you see, they were not able to talk about creation because it was illegal. In fact, if you talked about God or creation, they sent you off to the gulag. But now, freedom of thought, you can talk about creation, and that's exactly what they're doing. But here in California, we're going the other direction. Now, in our next presentation, we're going to deal with these foundational principles of evolution and to see whether or not they can be backed up by supportable evidence. Tonight, as I conclude, I want to turn to the book of Job. And I want to read a few verses from Job, which I believe are in line with what we have been doing this evening. The Bible challenges us to think for ourselves. In Job chapter 12 and verse 7, the Bible says this, "But now ask the beasts, and let them teach you." So we should go out and we should look at living things. Look at the animals. Look at the creatures. They will teach you. It goes on to say, "And the birds of the heaven, and let them tell you, or speak to the earth, and let it teach you." Look at the layers of the earth, examine them, and to see what they tell us. In verse 8, it continues, "And let the fish of the sea declare to you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this?" In verse 10, "In whose hand is the life of every living thing, and the breath of all mankind." You see, that's what Paul told those in his day that didn't believe in God the Creator. They believed that everything was God. They were worshiping the heavens, the moon, the earth, the sun as God. And he said to them on Mars Hill, you're religious, but you're worshiping the wrong things. Worship the unknown God. He is the one who created you, who gave you breath, who gave you life. In verse 11, does not the ear test words as the palate tastes its food? You see, just as your mouth can taste food and determine what is good or what is not, so God has given you a brain, a mind. And you can look at the evidence, and you can examine the evidence, and you can make decisions. And your decision is very simple. Either God did it, or evolution did it. Two choices, creation or evolution. You see, I believe that the biblical creationist account can be backed up by the evidence. I believe that you can be a Christian and you can actually have your head screwed onto your shoulders because there's supportable evidence to support what the Bible says you can believe. What the Bible says about physical things can be supported by the evidence. And what the Bible says about spiritual things is also true. That is that you and I have a need for a Redeemer, Jesus Christ. You can believe the Bible. It's true about creation. It's true about the creation of man. It's true about the fall of man and the separation of man from God. And it's true about the offer that God made for you and I. He sent His Son, Jesus Christ, the creator of all things, to this earth. And He lived a perfect life for us. That if we would accept that sacrifice that He made for you and I, that we could once again have a relationship with Him, the creator of all things. The Bible, the creation model, it's true.